Hey folks, this is Steve with Nonprofit Ally, and this is a webcast with author Kathleen Kelly-Janus. She's the author of Social Startup Success, talking about how emerging nonprofits become sustainable, long-term growing nonprofits. Great. Hope you enjoy. Hey folks, this is Steve with Nonprofit Ally, and I am actually using Zoom today to record this podcast, which is it's kind of a webinar. It's almost like Skype, but you have to pay for it, but it has better features. Anyway, I'm talking to Kathleen Kelly-Janus. She is an award-winning social entrepreneur. She's an author and a lecturer at Stanford University. She's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, Stanford Social Innovation Review, the TechCrunch, and the San Francisco Chronicle. She is the co-founder of Spark, which actually I want to hear more about, which is the largest network of millennial donors in the world. And she is the author of Social Startup Success, How the Best Nonprofits Launch, Scale Up, and Make a Difference. So you have an impressive resume. Kathleen, hey, thanks for being on the program.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
So with all that, how did you even find time to write a book?
Well, I have given birth to 3 babies since I decided to write this book, and I feel like this is very much like my 4th child.
There you go.
It's exciting to see it all come together. I've been working on it for the last 5 years, and I really have been inspired to write this book by so many nonprofits that I've seen who are struggling. I grew up in a small town where my family volunteered a lot at soup kitchens or low-income medical clinics for workers, and we spent a lot of time giving back to the community, but my parents always made us aware that it wasn't just about supporting those people who were in need, it was also about supporting the organizations that were often in need. And I learned from our dinner table conversations that nonprofit organizations often struggle, and that we all have a duty to make sure that they are strong so that they can provide those crucial social services to those people in our communities who are more vulnerable. So the book is really a product of that inspiration, wanting to serve organizations that are struggling and give them stories and tools and strategies that they can use to make their organizations stronger for the long term.
Oh, that's great. It sounds like it's in your blood. And if you're talking about dinner table conversations about this kind of stuff, well, that's great. That's a great way to approach it too. It's like there's people out there that need help, but the organizations that help them always need just as much help as well. So you talked about the struggles. Can you identify, are there some common struggles you see that are systematic is a bad word, but common, I guess is the best word, that you see with startups or just nonprofits? Is there a type of struggling that's going on there that you're seeing that is kind of more widespread?
Nonprofits struggle across the board with a lot of the issues that I talk about in the book. If you ask nonprofit leaders what the number one problem they face is, and this was a question that I asked in a survey I did of hundreds of social entrepreneurs, 81% of them answered that access to capital is their biggest challenge. Oh, cool.
I just drew that.
Money, yes.
That's right. A little different way of saying it, but capital. Okay, so go on, please.
Capital. And as it turns out, in the research that I did at Stanford, I learned that 2/3 of nonprofits in the United States are $500,000 in revenue and below. And many of those organizations should stay small nonprofits, community-based, serving really important needs, but many of them should grow, and many of them have incredible ideas that are dying on the vine because they can't get the capital that they need to scale. And so I became really curious, well, what are the organizations doing that are scaling and that are getting access to that capital? What are they doing differently, and how are they laying the foundation for success?
Okay, cool. So capital being, I always find it interesting when I go to software sites or when I interview people and I check out their agencies and stuff like that, they ask these questions about the nonprofit. How many employees do you have? What's your annual revenue and stuff like that? And it's always like, what's your revenue? 500,000 or less, 500 to $1 million. And it's just like, the percent of people that are checking 500,000 or less is large. Just the idea that you could have hundreds of, I'm sure a lot of nonprofits listening now, the idea that I can have hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital coming in and revenue to work with would just be phenomenal, right? So you're obviously hitting on a common thread here. Before we touch on what you learned about that, are there other struggles that people are having? So obviously capital, okay. And are there other ones that stick out?
Well, I would say that the struggles that nonprofits have actually mirror the strategies that I talk about in the book. And in the book, Social Startup Success, I talk about the solutions to those problems. So maybe it's a great opportunity to give you a little preview of what those are.
Sweet.
So the first struggle that I talk about is innovation and how to integrate innovation into an organization's culture and DNA. And the way that I saw organizations doing this is by testing and developing a set of robust tools to test their ideas before they take them to market. And this is important because the organizations that are able to do that have impact to show for the work that they're doing, so that when they go out and talk to foundations, they actually get funded because they can show that they're making a difference.
Right.
The second strategy I talk about is measuring impact and the importance of measuring that impact from the very start of the organization. This can be a real challenge for organizations who are swimming in data, drowning in data, actually. 75% of nonprofits say that they measure their impact, but only 6% of them feel like they are doing it well. And so in the book, I talk about ways that organizations can be more effective in measuring their impact. The third strategy I talk about is funding experimentation, and this gets right to the heart of that question that you had about access to capital and how organizations get access to that capital. And they do that by testing a combination of both for-profit earned income sources as well as philanthropic capital, and figuring out the funding model that really works for each individual organization. Because the reality is there is no one-size-fits-all model, that every organization has to figure out their own model for scale. The fourth strategy I talk about is how organizations develop collective leadership. Oftentimes, organizations really struggle with how to be the program manager, the fundraiser, the janitor in chief, and everything in between, because the executive director is often really wearing all of those hats at once. And so the organizations that I saw that scaled were able to take that leap and really bring on staff to surround them and develop a distributed leadership model that capitalized on the strengths of all those people around them. And this allowed the founders to go out and raise the capital that they needed to scale and have that strategic vision and spend that time on the strategic visioning that was going to help them get there.
Right.
And then the final strategy that I talk about is storytelling with purpose. And I think we all have this tendency to hear a great TED Talk or a great political speech and think, wow, that person is just a natural. But the reality is that when you go out and talk with these really great speakers, they all say, you have no idea how much coaching that I've gotten to get to this point. And so the best organizations prioritize storytelling, not only at the leadership level, but at every single level of the organization, because they know that those beneficiaries and staff and board members can all be champions for the cause. And ultimately, those brand ambassadors are going to be able to bring together the movement and to build the organization from there.
So not just storytelling, like I'm going to put it out on my blog and on social media, but internal social telling between board members, learning how to do it and use it so when they go out in the public, they can share the story.
Yeah, giving them the tools to understand how to build their own personal connection to the cause and how to take the time to practice that storytelling so that you are cocktail party ready when you do go out into public. Yeah.
Oh my God. This is going to be a great interview because you just outlined the whole thing for me. You just made my job easy. So these 5 steps, let's talk about them. And I think, I was going to jump into capital right away, and I'm glad you did this first because these all tie in with each other. Like a lot of these are dependent on each other or support each other. So you're talking about the innovation, the measuring the impact, funding, can't read my own writing, the leadership, collective leadership, and then storytelling. We'll just start right at the beginning. How's that sound? We're going to go with the innovation. And one thing you said about the innovation process was testing before going to market. So people have ideas, or maybe they don't have ideas, or maybe they don't know how to tackle what they're trying to help with. So I guess that's what you're talking about, like where's the innovation process go? And let's talk about that testing part. Like never really thought about testing the program before going to market. If I have an idea, usually it's just the testing happens live, right?
Yeah. Well, what's so exciting is that the nonprofit sector has all of these great tools to draw from that have become popular in the business world nowadays, like human-centered design, which is a built-in testing process for figuring out how to do low-cost prototypes of ideas to make sure that they work before going out and launching a whole product. Once you get out into the funding arena and you have set that stake in the ground and said, this is what I'm doing, it's a lot harder to go out and change that idea. And so this testing process is critical because it allows entrepreneurs to really focus on the problem as opposed to getting attached to their solution. Mm-hmm. And so let me give you an example. Beth Schmidt, who founded Wishbone, a crowdfunding site for low-income kids to test out their passions by having really incredible summer experiences in film or arts or culinary academies, whatever they're passionate about. When she first started this idea, she didn't go out and launch a whole web platform and then try and find the kids to test out the idea. She started by photocopying some papers that she had assigned as a school teacher in a low-income area in Los Angeles. And she sent those photocopied papers, which were essays asking the students to talk about their passions, to her friends and to her family, and said, would you be willing to give some money to these kids so that they could pursue these passions over the summer? And she got back a few $1,000s and was able to send these kids to summer camp and realized that actually she was having a huge impact on their lives by doing that. And so it prompted her through this low-cost testing process to actually launch an organization. But even then, she continued to test the model as it grew, trying out different models for fundraising, for example, and figuring out, well, could she get fellowships or scholarships from the programs so that the students wouldn't have to raise too much money? Could she get the students involved in this fundraising process themselves, giving them the tools to learn how to fundraise, which is not only bringing revenue into the door, but which is also giving these kids a skill that they can use for life in fundraising and gaining that kind of level of confidence. So there's a lot of things that you can do to test that don't necessarily require a lot of capital. And this is really critical to organizations because you can't get too stuck on your idea. Mm-hmm. Climate changes, conditions change, and you have to constantly be evaluating whether what you're doing is working in order to maximize the impact of the resources that you have.
Right. So it almost sounds like what she, in that example, and maybe this, I don't want to make this a blanket statement, but it's in some way reverse engineering or scaling down the idea and trying to figure out a way to test the waters with it. In some way she took this, did she already have the big idea of doing this in the first place and then just kind of scaled it down and had this first stepping stone?
Yeah, in the human-centered design process, the idea of prototyping involves figuring out the lowest cost option for testing it out and asking your customers if this is something they're going to want. Another example from the book that I talk about is the story of Aspire Schools that wanted to develop preschools for their K through 8 students. they didn't go out and build a preschool. They had this idea of a mobile preschool that they went out and tested by creating this little cardboard bus and taking it out to families and saying, would you put your students on this bus? Would you put your children on this bus to go to preschool? And they got really valuable feedback without actually having to buy a bus in order to build that preschool, which is actually quite capital intensive and expensive.
Right. And so testing the idea, so figuring out a way to test that idea. So it doesn't matter whether it's a product or a program.
Right.
Okay, cool. So do you recommend this for all programs and all products that you're coming out with? Like if you have an idea and this is something new and because people get excited, they just want to implement, right?
Yeah.
And you know it's going to work. So do you have ideas on figuring out how to scale it down to get that? You're talking about that lowest cost. So is that kind of the gateway into there?
Yeah, the prototyping is really important, and staying really close to your beneficiaries and learning from them and talking with them and keeping those relationships so that you can get an honest feedback loop to see whether it's actually working, and to be honest with yourself when it's not, and learning how to accept failure and say, okay, this isn't working, try something different. That's really critical to success.
Right. And so figuring out if you're failing or not kind of ties into the next step you're talking about, is measuring that impact. Now, are you measuring, one, I want to hear all about how you measure impact, because I love data. People who listen to this podcast know when I hear data and software, I get all excited for some reason. But now, measuring the impact, are you doing this also at that prototype level? Are you trying to take that stuff and get the feedback and the information on if the program is going to succeed? And then at that point, measuring that data, what are the data points? How are you measuring these things?
Well, I think this is really hard for social entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders that do not get as excited when they hear data. For most people, actually, they do not get excited. They get scared when they hear that word data, because nonprofit leaders come into this work because they're passionate about the issues, not because they're data scientists. And so people often think that that is a barrier to collecting any sort of meaningful impact data for their work. And then the other barrier is, I think, really figuring out what meaningful actually means in the data context. Most organizations collect really strong data about their outputs. How many people are they serving in their programs? How many people are getting jobs as a result of their programs? They're not so good at looking at the long-term outcomes to figure out what is the behavior change on that person that has participated in the program as a result of that organization's intervention. And that's where we need to move as a sector. And that's where the best, most successful organizations that actually do get funded are able to shine, because funders are honestly getting much more savvy toward that difference between outputs and outcomes. Right. And so if you want to be as successful as a nonprofit, you have to really dive deep into the work and figure out what that means for your organization.
Right. Can you give us some more examples of that? I think when people hear data, first of all, data just sounds like, oh, I don't even know what that is. But, data is name, address, phone number. Data is how many kids did you feed that day, or how many kids graduated from your program. But you're talking, and that I think is all like outcome data, as opposed to what you're talking about. What's the output?
Yeah.
Or maybe I have that reversed. But if you can explain that a little more, the difference between those, because we get focused on, well, we served 120 kids this year, and that means they all got lunch. So that's an outcome.
Yeah.
That's the outcome.
Yeah. So a really great example that I saw in my research was an organization called 1 Degree, which is a Yelp-like platform for social services in the Bay Area. When they founded their organization, they hired a chief technology officer. They built a really sophisticated website and were so excited that overnight they had 40,000 users on their website. That was a huge, what they thought, outcome for the organization, that they had 40,000 visitors. they quickly realized that those were not real impact numbers, that those were vanity metrics that made them feel good about their work, but weren't really telling them anything about what people were doing when they got to the website, what kinds of social services they were getting as a result of visiting the website, whether they were actually getting those services, and whether those services were actually having an impact on that person's long-term outcome and behavior change, whether it was getting jobs or getting access to health services. And so they changed their platform so that they could actually start to capture some of that more meaningful data. So they developed what they called a My Plan kind of platform on the website, so that people had to log in and they could actually trace a user's trajectory on the website to see what kind of services they were getting, what was happening afterwards, to track their longer term behavior change as a result of visiting that website. And so I think every organization needs to ask itself, how could we be going deeper? How could we be testing the counterfactual? Just because a student's test score increased as a result, after your program, does not mean that it was a result of your program. Mm-hmm. And so how do you look deep at your data to try to not just prove that what you're doing is working, but improve your programs to ensure that you're being as effective as possible?
Right. And so tracking that, especially at long term, right? So some of these people in your programs might be long gone. Are you actually talking like boots on the ground, phone calling, letters, surveys to follow up and get this data? Is it as fundamental as that?
Absolutely. And a lot of organizations really build this into their model so that they can capture that data in the long term. Genesis Works, an organization that helps with job training for high school seniors, actually has cocktail parties where they bring people back into the program. And as a part of that event, they have a survey to talk about what kind of work they're doing and how the program impacted their lives. They also do an annual survey, and they have a really high response rate because people feel really attached to the program and they want to continue to get access to mentorship and to resources from the program. And so participating in that survey is actually absolutely a way to stay connected. And so organizations have to ask themselves, what are we doing to capture the kind of the longer term impact of the work, and how are we engaging our beneficiaries, not just while they're in their program, but for the long term?
I like the idea of incentivizing the return, like have a party, a dessert party, and whatever, right? And you're bringing back these people who are users in your programs, and then they're there and they're happy to share. Most likely they're happy to share.
And it doesn't even have to be, something in person. I mean, you could have a Facebook group that tracks people, that, gets them engaged every once in a while in an online setting.
That's good. Yeah, and with a Facebook group, you can make that private or invite only, and you really have access to just the people in your program. So you're not flooding your Facebook page with stuff that's just going to be lost in the timeline. So I like that. That's a good way to do it too. So just innovative ways of gathering data from users and putting them in the groups or mails, or having some type of event to bring that data in. Any tips on figuring out what data we're trying to collect? That just, again, like we have name, address, how many kids showed up. How would you determine, like, how do you go into your programs and figure out, well, what is a long-term outcome we're looking for?
Well, for every organization, it's going to be different. And in the book, I talk about how organizations need to figure out not the 100 things that matter to the organization, but what are the 3 to 5 measures that really matter and whether you're having an impact that you want. So an example that I talk about in the book is Braven, an organization that prepares low-income college students for the job market. And so when they started the organization, they were starting with a freshman class. Their ultimate impact was not going to be seen for several years to see if they graduated and to see if they ultimately got a job. And so they had to figure out, okay, well, what are the things that we can track now, and how can we track them in a simplistic way that makes sense, and that ultimately shows that we're on track towards achieving our long-term goal. So they started to look at things like, are students attending classes as a way to track whether they would actually graduate? Or they looked at, our mentors saying that they would actually recommend these students for jobs down the road as a way to track, would they actually have a propensity to get a job down the road? And so these are the kind of key questions that you need to be asking that are going to be different in the case of every single organization. But once you figure out what those are, then it doesn't have to be that complicated, that you can put a system into place, especially using the technology that we have access to today, to keep track of it on a regular basis and to get all of your staff involved as well.
Cool. I recall I wrote down a note about this too, right when you gave off these five points that we're making here. Start right away. Start from the beginning. So start tracking that data right away. Just real quick, folks. This we keep referring to your book. I mentioned it once, but boy, just listening to you, this sounds like a book that a lot of my listeners would benefit from. Social Startup Success: How the Best Nonprofits Launch, Scale Up, and Make a Difference. A well-researched book. You're hearing lots of examples right now of just real life stuff, and there are more in it. And I think my listeners would love that, because I like to make this podcast as real life and boots on the ground as possible. And it sounds like your book is full of those examples. So moving on, let's go ahead and go on to what I thought would be the first thing, which was money, right? So we're talking about funding and things like that, and we're to that point, right? You've got the innovative program idea, you're collecting the data, and now we're ready to present this in some way and try to get some capital. How are we going about doing that? What do I have in here? Oh, it's just access to capital. Yeah, let's talk about access to capital.
Well, the best organizations figure out how, as I said, to develop a funding model that works for their particular cause. And they do that based on figuring out the right combination of both for-profit income generating activities combined with philanthropic capital. And this is a really testing process. Again, we talk a lot about testing in the product side or on the programmatic side, but I don't think people typically think of testing on the fundraising side. I think people think about like, okay, well, I'm going to look at what my philanthropic capital is, who are my individual donors, what are the foundations that I'm going, but it really goes beyond that. It goes to looking at what are the strategies that I can use to maximize my potential to get capital in any one of those areas. And so to give you an example, an organization I feature in the book is Hot Bread Kitchen, a training program for low-income women to get them into the food industry based in New York. And so when they founded the program, they were looking at trying to develop a model that would be 100% sustainable. They thought, okay, we're going to get a model that is going to pay for itself. We won't have to have any philanthropic capital. And so they started testing out that model. They had a cafe that sold the baked goods that the women baked, and they had a wholesale model selling bread to Whole Foods and to JetBlue. They had an incubator where they rented out space to small business owners to cook goods to sell at farmers markets. And so all of these income generating activities were absolutely supporting the program, but they realized very quickly that they were actually selling themselves short by not accepting philanthropic capital as well. So for example, providing childcare for the women, maybe not really a profitable thing, but certainly the right thing to do and something that they could cover if they did bring in philanthropic capital, or extending the length of the program in a way that made the women even more prepared for work, maybe not profitable, but certainly something that was on a long-term basis more effective for the women and the participants in their program. And so ultimately the organization came to develop a model that was not 100% financially self-sustaining, that was 65% reliant on earned income and 35% reliant on philanthropic capital. And that was the right mix of philanthropic funding and revenue generating income that worked for them. But for every organization, it's going to be different. And so what's key is figuring out how to test different strategies quickly to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Right. It's like having a diversified portfolio in some sense. So that philanthropic diversified revenue stream, are you talking anything from foundational grants to donations to potluck, well, not potlucks, bake sales or whatever, crowdfunding, like a variety of different ways of raising money through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely about diversification and looking at the different buckets where you can raise money. But then even within those buckets, thinking about how you're raising the money is critical to success and critical to maximizing your potential to access capital. So one strategy that I talk about in the book that I think every organization is really happy to hear about is getting other people to raise money for you. You do not have to be alone in this. And actually, Room to Read, a worldwide $50 million organization that is focused on girls' education and providing libraries to schools that don't have access to books, raises 40% of its capital from its champions that are around the country in various chapters around the world. And they have created an entire program around bringing these people to San Francisco to hear about the inspiring stories, taking them through fundraising training so that they can go back to their community and use those inspiring stories to raise money for the organizations, taking them to Africa, to India, to Nepal, where they have their programs, and allowing them to touch and feel the impact of their work so that they're even more inspired to go out and raise money for the cause. So I often ask organizations, what are you doing to engage donors so that they can be more committing to others to raise money for the organization as well? So thinking about strategies outside the box for both developing, for developing income strategies within each one of these buckets is really critical to success.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I like the idea of engaging that donor, and some of what you're doing there, jumping ahead 2 points, is you're giving them storytelling opportunities. So if they go to India and actually touch and feel the programs you're supporting, you've just made this donor a storyteller at the same time. You've given them that opportunity to do that. But that's really cool. So, and one thing I wanted to touch on too, which I thought was really neat, I like the bread with women in New York and the bread stuff that you were talking about, the bakery. The idea that the childcare, even though it was a low-cost expense, it seemed minor, but they're actually building capacity by doing that because they're making it easier for these women to go out and learn these skills and do the work. So in some sense, at least that kind of struck me as just capacity building in some sense on some level. All right, cool.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the next one. This is great. So we have I can't read my writing. What is this? Oh, collective leadership. Now that's leadership. Boy, we could talk all about this in one podcast, I think, in itself. You talked about the many hats, which I think all of us experience. But how does, what does that have to do? Because this you have in there as a key component in this whole process. Give us some examples of what you mean by that.
Well, I think this is one of those findings that runs contrary to what we think of when we think of social entrepreneurship or nonprofit leaders. We tend to revere our leaders in society generally and associate a single person with the success of an entire entity. Whether it's on the for-profit side, we associate Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook or Steve Jobs with Apple, or even on the nonprofit side, we associate Mohammed Yunus with developing the entire microfinance industry, when in fact there are thousands of people behind the scenes who are making this possible. And in fact, the organizations that tend to succeed must rely on a team of leaders to support them, because nobody can solve a social problem by themselves. And what's really critical is laying the foundation for that distributed model of leadership from the very early stages of an organization, so that your staff have the tools to thrive in their roles and feel really connected to the mission. So in the book, I talk about flipping that pyramid on its head and turning the hierarchy upside down, so that staff are really the ones who are the most important in the organization, because they're the ones who are on the front line serving beneficiaries often. But it's not just about staff, it's also about engaging your board, and that board chair ED partnership can be a really critical catalyst to taking an organization to the next level. And so a lot of organizations go through growing pains of moving from that friends and family early stage board made up of people that are close to you, to figuring out who are going to be the leaders who are really going to take this organization to the next level.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that's that partnership, the ED and the president or chair. I've had great experiences with that. And then I've also had just power struggles with egos, right? You deal with people who are like, well, I'm the president and I get to say, and they have their vision and they try to force it on everyone, even if it's not right for the organization. So that partnership, when it works, was beautiful. We had a great, and I think that it I hate this term, but it does trickle down. If the board president and the ED are working well together, the board is smoother, the staff is smoother. It's just cohesive. It brings that partnership in there. So let's talk about turning this on its head again. All right. So I'm the ED or the founder of this organization, and you instantly, in many cases, become the face of the organization, whether you like it or not. You're the one that's going to charity events. Yes. You're the one that's speaking at the local like Kiwanis Club or whatever they are, things like that. So you're going to these community events, you're doing this, you're the face of the organization. How do you intentionally turn this thing upside down?
Well, what's really important is figuring out ways to empower your staff so that you're not the bottleneck for the most important relationships. So some of the EDs that I talked about using we language as opposed to I language, never kind of going into a donor meeting claiming that they are responsible for the success of the organization, that making clear that this is a team effort, and then bringing team members with you to highlight their work, but not only team members but also beneficiaries. I talked with a number of EDs who had chances to have their moment in the spotlight. So for example, Alan Casey and Michael Brown of City Year, very early on, they got the support of then candidate Bill Clinton, who was at the time only 3% in the polls, but took a little interest in this program that they were developing for national service. And so he came to their office. This was their first big moment to shine in the national spotlight. But they didn't put themselves at the table. They put their service corps members at the table. And I think that's really critical, is knowing when to actually step out of the spotlight and allow those who are closest to the story to do the storytelling.
Yeah, wow, that's great advice. And it would get us out of some speaking engagements too. So
yeah.
No, but I like that. I'm just being silly, but yeah, I like that idea, because and that gives more story opportunities, and I think people want to share their story, and it gives them a sense of ownership, which they should have. Like, that builds teams. Right.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
So how did before we move on to the last one, how did you come across this as being that key? Like, this must have come up over and over and over at times, and you must have seen it in different areas where, wow, this is a really important piece of this. Like, how did you just come out in your interview process of research?
Well, it was both in the interview and the survey. One survey question that was really critical was asking, what was your biggest catalyst to scale? And for so many of the organizations, the biggest catalyst to scale was when they hired that first senior team member. So whether it was a chief operating officer or head of programs, or for technology companies, so for example, chief technology officer. And that was really what allowed the ED to step outside of that day-to-day management of the programming, and allow their team to take over so that they could then focus on the fundraising and the strategic planning that helped them take the organization to the next level. And so that happens often in organizations, and it's getting through that bottleneck period that helps provide a catalyst for scale.
Well, great. Okay. Yeah, I can totally see that helping me right now. I don't know if you know a lot about what we do here, but I have a nonprofit that I started. That's how I ended up starting Nonprofit Ally. And I have a nonprofit I run, but I am the program, I run the program too. So there's only so much time in the day, right? And so it's
definitely
gets stuck with me at some point. And when I have good help.
Well, and I think what's important is that executive directors have to realize that they don't have to reinvent the wheel, that there are people who are experts on management, on figuring out management structure and the right framework. And so many of the organizations, I would say, if not almost all of the founders that I interviewed had executive coaches along the way who helped them get to the next stage. One story that I love is Abby Falik of Global Citizen Year very early on realized that she wasn't going to be able to do it all. And so her coach told her, take a week, make a list of everything that you do in your day, and then categorize it as what gives you energy and what takes energy away. And your job at the end of the week is to hire for everything that takes away your energy and do everything that gives you energy. And ultimately, that's what's going to make the organization fly. And so, of course, it's not like that happens overnight. And, all of a sudden you get to hire all these people to do all these things that you hated, like, managing finance or whatever it might be. But it gave her a North Star, and it gave her a plan to get the organization to a place of sustainability where she could hire for those positions. And she knew in advance what those positions were so that she could have a plan to get there.
Right. So now you have a target of certain skills you're looking for. And even if you relieve yourself of some of those duties, you're now being able to focus more on the things that give you energy. So I like that idea. I'm going to have to remember that one. So, all right.
I think anyone can do this in their life generally.
yeah. Whether it's a nonprofit, a business, or whatever, right? Just
personal.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, great. All right, we'll move on to that last one that you were mentioning. That was storytelling. Now, we focus on storytelling. Well, recently, not much, but we certainly have in this podcast. And I think people think of storytelling as social media, videos, and things like that, and telling their story in blogs. But I think you have maybe a dual meaning here. Maybe you can explain more about how storytelling fits into this model.
Well, storytelling really is about getting people involved in your cause. And so storytelling is important, whether it's for fundraising purposes, whether it's for movement building, whether it's to build partnerships, or even to get beneficiaries to participate in your programs. And so you have to be a good storyteller if you want to have a successful nonprofit. But what most people don't realize is just how purposeful good storytelling is. I have a dear friend who runs the Center for Youth Wellness, and she gave a TED Talk that has 3 million views, has been a huge success for the organization, and is leading to a book project. And people ask her all the time, how did you do that? How did you learn to be such a good storyteller? And she says, you have no idea how long I practiced that TED Talk, that by the end of the 6 months that I had been working on it, my husband practically could have given the TED Talk for me because he had heard it so many times. And so I think it's a good reality check that even the most effective orators, or maybe especially the most effective orators, come with a lot of practice that helps them get there. And then also looking internally within the organization and thinking about, okay, well, how do you also extend that to staff? Many organizations had opportunities for their staff and their board to practice on a regular basis, practice their storytelling. IDEO.org has something they call storytelling roulette, where you spin the wheel in a staff meeting and then that staff member has to tell the story of whatever project the wheel lands on. And it's a way for people to learn how to tell stories on their feet, to get accustomed to stories that they may not have known in the past, and to then be willing and ready to go out and tell those stories when they are at that proverbial cocktail party or conference or whatever the case may be.
Right. I like that idea. Boy, what a nice way to kind of break up a meeting, have a little storytelling for that game. It's sometimes they're hard to sit through, but
and I wrote things interesting.
Yeah, and it might put you on the spot, but I like the idea too. You might you might hear a story about a program that you didn't realize, and then you've learned a story that you could share, and so on.
Yep.
I wrote down the cocktail party thing, and just because I think that's when we come up to the point where it's almost like an elevator pitch. You have someone says, "Oh, what do you do?" or "What do they do? I've heard of them," and now you're on, right? And you have, and you're saying in some sense we've rehearsed this. How do we know? Maybe this is a self-answering question, but how do we know when we have a good story? Like, how do we identify the story that we're going to be using that most exemplifies what our nonprofit's doing?
Well, again, it all comes back to testing. And one of the tricks that I use in the book is test it out with people around you. Get people that you trust and feel safe with to test it out. It doesn't take a professional communications expert to test out whether a story is effective. You can get people who might want to volunteer for the organization. We did this for one board I was on. Bring them in for a board meeting and have them come sit down and just listen to your stories and tell you what works and what doesn't for them as listeners, just as normal people, because these are the people that you're oftentimes convincing. And I think that's also helpful to organizations who might not have resources to hire a professional communications team to help them build their story. We all have access to people who can help tell us whether our stories are effective or not.
Right. Yeah. And for those who aren't good at telling stories, you can learn it, right? You can learn there's the whole kind of climax, denouement, and all that to go with stories and voice inflection and all that. But there's articles on there. There'd be a podcast on it, on how to tell a good story. But finding the subject matter is also important. Holy cow, that is a lot of information. Folks, this sounds like a really great book. Kathleen, tell us how we would get a hold of you, because this is definitely something I think people want to follow up with. So how do we find you on the web? Where are you at?
Well, I'm at KathleenJanus.com. And if you go to my website, I have all sorts of tools that help support the theories and strategies and tactics that I talk about in the book. So for example, there's an evaluation toolkit that will help you determine whether you are on track to social startup success. I also have a free fundraising course that is available to anybody who pre-orders Social Startup Success. So take a look and go buy Social Startup Success at your favorite online retailer.
Cool. And if they go to your site, can they find that pre-order button?
They absolutely can.
All right. We'll make sure, and folks that maybe who are jogging right now or anything like that, who want to, it's Kathleen, which is Kathleen. Janus is JANUS.com. We'll make sure we have a link to that in the show notes. And that's a great offer, folks. There's a fundraising course available if you buy the book, and why not? It sounds like it sounds like a great book. Actually, I have a preview copy of this book. One of the advantages of being a host. So that's always fun. But of course, folks go there and you get the opportunity to get a fundraising course, and you can never learn too much about any of this. Janus, what a great conversation. Thank you so much for being on the program, and good luck with the book launch. I hope that it goes successful for you, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Hey, thanks so much for watching that video. Hey, if you liked it, be sure to subscribe right down there below. Or if you're already a subscriber, click that little bell right next to there, and that will make sure you get notified of any new videos we publish. Also, more videos over there if you'd like to watch them. Thanks so much for watching, folks.